What you're looking at is what I believe to be every major conference tournament game in the history of men's college basketball. It's every tournament game for all 32 current Division I conferences, as well as 7 defunct ones. This dataset stretches back a full century to the introduction of the Southern Conference tournament in 1922, and includes every result through the mid-season tournament the Southland Conference held just this January. That's 11,401 conference tournament games. Here they are graphed by the winner's margin of victory. Conference tournaments provide the ideal scenario for good, close games. Most teams in every conference are of relatively equal strength, more or less, and the games are usually played at a neutral site. It should be no surprise that 6,029 of these games, almost 53%, finished with a single-digit scoring margin. This is why some people will tell you conference tourney season is even better than the NCAA tournament. When you tune into a conference tournament game, more often than not, you're getting a back-and-forth game with high stakes between two teams who really don't like each other. Of course, that means that just about as often you're watching a game in which one of those teams is clearly superior. About a third of these games finished with a margin from 10 to 19, and another 10% finished with a margin in the 20s. This is getting into blowout territory, but these margins are still well within the realm of normalcy. That leaves this sliver on the right, 340 games that resulted in runaway victories of 30 points or more. These games aren't supposed to happen. It's well established that teams winning big tend to take their foot off the gas in almost any scenario, and in conference tournaments they have even more incentive to do so. These tournaments often have teams playing multiple days in a row, and with so much at stake, it makes all the sense in the world to rest your best players as much as you can. But these games happen a few times a year. 30, 40, 50-point wins. 5 of these games, these ones way up here, have even broken 60. How do you win a conference tournament game by 60 points? Do you really want to know? It's a little hard to tell on the chart, but number 5 is actually a tie for 4th between two different elite programs in two different conferences, 21 years apart, coached by the same man. That man is Rick Pitino, whose 2 61-point conference tournament blowout wins are the entire reason I researched this topic in the first place. I thought maybe they'd be tied for the greatest margin of victory in conference tournament history. Turns out that was wrong, and we'll get to the ones that beat him in a moment, but for now, let's focus on Rick. His first 61-point blowout came at Kentucky, but he'd already accomplished a lot before he got to Lexington, and I'm gonna zip through it in under a minute. Ready? Rick played for UMass in the early 70s and graduated in 1974, at which point he immediately got an assistant coaching job under Bruce O'Neill at Hawaii. O'Neill was fired mid-season in 1976, and a 23-year-old Pitino led the team for their last 6 games before bouncing for Syracuse to coach under the up-and-coming Jim Boeheim. After 2 years there, he got his first full-time head coaching job at Boston University, where he had a relatively forgettable 5-year stint with 1 NCAA tournament appearance at the tail end. He parlayed that into an NBA assistant gig under Hubie Brown with the Knicks, where he stayed for 2 years before Providence offered him their head job. In his introductory press conference, he called Providence the best job in college basketball, and apparently he was right, because he led Providence to the Final Four in just his second year. The Knicks had fired Brown earlier that season and needed a new head coach, so they called Rick and he said yes. He stayed there 2 more years before Kentucky, at the time wrought with scandal that almost gave them the death penalty, tabbed him to lead the program back to the promised land. And that's exactly what he did. After a 2-year postseason ban, Pitino brought the Cats right back to a 2 seed and the Elite 8, and that brings us to 1993 and our first blowout. Here's what you need to know about Rick Pitino, why his teams were so good and why he rose through the coaching ranks so quickly. He was one of the first coaches to truly embrace a fun new gimmick called the 3-point line. These Kentucky teams were often called Pitino's Bombinos because their strategy on offense was just to rain hellfire from deep. They shot about twice as many threes as their opponents and were way more efficient to boot. This game plan led them to be ranked in the top 5 of the AP poll for the entire 1993 season. The SEC was weak this year, so Kentucky dominated the also-rans and only lost to other serious contenders. One exception. February 24th in Knoxville against Tennessee, arguably the worst team in the league. Kentucky had no business losing this game, even on the road, but the Vols jumped out to a decent halftime lead and withheld a Kentucky surge well enough to stay within one possession well into crunch time. With 5 seconds to play and the Cats leading by 3, they intentionally fouled the Vols' Allen Houston to prevent a potential game-tying 3-pointer. Quick side note, being able to do this is terrible game design. Get rid of it, I don't care how. Houston knew they didn't have enough time to give Kentucky another possession, so after hitting the first free throw, he missed the second on purpose and went for the rebound. But look at this shot. Free throw shooters aren't allowed to cross the line until their shot hits the rim, but Houston lets his momentum carry him into the paint basically as soon as the ball leaves his hands. That's a lane violation, and a blatant one at that, which should result in the play being blown dead and Kentucky getting the ball. Instead, the refs swallow their whistles, Corey Allen grabs the offensive rebound and turns it into a game-tying bucket and the foul. He'd sink the free throw to give the Vols a 78-77 lead, and that would be that. Kentucky got jobbed, and the loss knocked them behind Vanderbilt in the division standings, where they'd stay for the rest of the year. Thankfully for them, that put them in just the right spot on the SEC tournament bracket for a rematch. Just 2 weeks after the game in Knoxville, Pitino wanted revenge, the players wanted revenge, and the SEC tournament this year was in Lexington, so the crowd wanted revenge. Let's just say everyone involved got what they came for. 7 Wildcats scored in double figures. They held Allen Houston to just 3 points in what would be his last college game before getting picked 11th in that summer's NBA draft. And, as usual, they thrived from beyond the arc, shooting 27 threes and making 12 of them. Perhaps the saddest thing about this game for Tennessee? They tried to keep up with Kentucky's 3-point shooting. They just couldn't. 101-40. It's glorious. But enough about this game. Rick still got another team to crush. You already know the next one happened 21 years later, so let me fast forward through some more of his career. 1 more minute on the clock, please. That 93 season ended at the Final Four, but Rick wasn't done there, as he'd win his first national title in 96 and return to the title game the next year. He then decided he wanted another shot at the NBA, so he left Kentucky to become the president and head coach of the Celtics, who were then in the midst of their worst era in franchise history. He didn't make it any better, but hey, Larry Bird wasn't walking through that door. After resigning in disgrace in 2001, he went back to the college ranks and took over for retiring legend Denny Crum at Louisville. With Rick, the Cardinals soared as high as ever. They made the Final Four in 2005, after which they moved up from Conference USA to the Big East, where they made the Final Four again in 2012 and won the tournament the next year. After this year, the 7 Catholic schools in the Big East split to form their own non-football conference, which would remain known as the Big East. The rest of the conference then became known as the American Athletic Conference, a place most of the big-name schools didn't want to be and immediately paid hefty fees to escape. But 2 of these schools got left in legal limbo and had to play out the 2014 season in the American. Those 2 schools were Louisville and Rutgers, which brings us to Rick's second blowout. Louisville was the best team in this decimated conference, and Rutgers was among the worst. They played twice in the regular season. Louisville won a very normal January game in Piscataway, then 6 weeks later, this happened. A 48-point drubbing in Louisville. So when they met in the conference tournament a month later in Memphis, no one quite knew what to expect. Everyone expected Louisville to win, but could Rutgers give them a scare like they had in New Jersey, or would it be a total laugher like the game in Kentucky? You already know the answer. Want to see how it played out? Louisville 92, Rutgers 31. Neither team wanted to be here, but only one played like it. Not only did Louisville win this game by 61 points, they had now outscored Rutgers by 109 in 2 games. Rutgers turned the ball over 26 times, and their leading scorer finished the game with 8 points. By comparison, Louisville only had 10 turnovers and 6 Cardinals scored at least 8 points. One of Rutgers' starters only took 1 shot, which he missed to finish with 0 points. Sounds pathetic, right? But guess what? The same was true for Louisville. Stephen Vantrease played 29 minutes and only took 1 shot, which he missed to finish with 0 points. Louisville's bench outscored Rutgers. Not Rutgers' bench, Rutgers. Rick Pitino had done it again. And his story's not over yet either. After leaving Louisville due to a cavalcade of scandals and being exiled to Greece for 2 years, he found his way back to college basketball yet again, signing on in 2020 with Iona, where he still coaches today. Iona's the best program in their conference. They're significantly better than the bottom of the league. So if he gets matched up with the right team on the wrong day, who knows? Maybe lightning can strike thrice. Number 3 doesn't deserve anyone's time. It didn't when it happened in 1992, and it doesn't today. Alas, it was a conference tournament game, and it did end with one team outscoring the other by 64 points, so it belongs on this list. Are you familiar with the East Coast Conference? Division II fans are screaming, yeah, of course, but no, I'm not talking about that one. The D1 East Coast Conference dates back to 1958, and they were a pioneer in making conference tournaments the spectacle they are now. They started their tournament in 1975 when only 3 other conferences regularly held one. Dozens of other conferences followed suit within the next decade, and that made early March look a lot more like it does today. The ECC at its peak also had some of the best basketball programs in the Mid-Atlantic. Temple, St. Joseph's, LaSalle. We're not going to be talking about any of those teams. All of them were gone by the early 80s, and the conference continued to hemorrhage teams in the decade that followed. By 92, they were on their last legs. They had Hofstra, Towson State, Rider, and 4 recent D1 call-ups. That wasn't enough full D1 members for the winner to earn an automatic bid to the NCAA tournament, so those 3 schools were also leaving at the end of this season, effectively killing the conference. The entire season was essentially meaningless from a competitive standpoint, and this was especially true of the conference tournament, which they still played for some reason despite no one involved really wanting to. None of the placeholder members in the ECC's twilight years were very good at basketball, but Buffalo was horrendous. This year was their first season back in D1 after spending about a decade in D3 and a few transition years in D2, and they absolutely weren't up to the task. They'd finished the season 2-26, going 0-12 in conference play, and who can blame them? The seniors on this team were recruited to play D3 basketball. They still had the same D3 head coach. They weren't supposed to be here. But they were. They were in the conference tournament too. Someone had to mercy kill their season, and the bracket decided that that someone would be Towson State. The final score was 122-58, and that's all the time I'll spend on this unnecessary game. For number 2, we're flipping the calendar all the way back to 1947. Only 2 major conferences held tournaments this year, and while I'd love to discuss what I'm sure was a thrilling SoCon final between UNC and NC State, it's the SEC where we find our next blowout. In this era, as in so many for SEC basketball, it was Kentucky's world, and everyone else was just taking up oxygen. This year in particular, they looked like men among boys. Look at some of these scores from conference play. 82-30 at Vanderbilt and then 84-41 in the rematch, 84-45 at Georgia and 81-40 in the rematch, 83-18 over Texas A&M, which isn't actually a conference game because A&M didn't join the SEC until 2012, but it's insane, so I'm counting it anyway. They were unstoppable. You know how a few times a year you'll see someone argue that the best college team could beat the worst NBA team, and in this day and age the argument seems absurd because of the obvious talent gap between the two, so they usually just get laughed out of the room? If that person was born about 70 years earlier, they'd have a point. This was pre-NBA, so there were still 2 competing pro leagues, the NBL and the BAA. The worst team in either, by far, was the NBL's Detroit Gems. In their only season, they went 4-40, and based on their average margin of defeat, were actually expected to go 1-43. Here's the most famous photo of this team, in which Bob Dykstra was apparently trying to rebound the ball with his face. This team sucked. They folded after the season and, funny enough, got sold to Minneapolis that summer to become the Lakers. They signed George Mikan for $15,000 and the rest is history. Kentucky wasn't beating that team, but this Gems team? I think Kentucky would have been heavily favored. I really do. Especially if the Gems somehow ended up in the SEC tournament. Short-time viewers might remember that these Kentucky teams were involved in point shaving, but no points were shaved in their second round game against Auburn, which they won 84-18. This score is nuts. Team scoring this low wasn't that uncommon before the 80s when the shot clock put an end to it. Mostly. The ACC was really bad with this. Of course, you had Dean Smith running the four corners offense for UNC, and NC State once beat Duke in an ACC tournament game 12-10, easily the lowest scoring conference tournament game of all time. But usually a score this low just indicates a slow game with very few possessions and not many opportunities to score. What makes this score nuts is the 84. Kentucky more than quadrupled Auburn's score. Both teams had plenty of opportunities. Auburn just couldn't do anything with them. If you're anything like me, you're wondering if any of Kentucky's players outscored Auburn by themselves. The answer is no, but Wawa Jones did tie them. This was an annihilation, and at 66 points, it would stand as the greatest conference tournament blowout for quite some time. If just one day earlier, they hadn't done this. February 27th, 1947, Louisville, Kentucky 98, Vanderbilt 29. A 69-point demolition. I'm not gonna say it. Combined with the Auburn game the very next day, this gave the Cats back-to-back conference tournament wins by a combined 135 points. Kentucky would win their other two games in this tournament by pedestrian margins of 22 and 17, but combined with the early round massacres, their total point differential in the 1947 SEC tournament was 174, which I'm fairly certain is an unbreakable record. Not only that, but combined with their two regular season contests, this game also gave the Cats 3 wins over Vanderbilt by a combined 164 points. Move over, Rick Pitino. Will we ever see anything like this again? In theory, it should be way easier now than it was back then. The shot clock forces games to run at a faster tempo, and the more possessions a game has, the more thoroughly a great team can dominate a bad one. The most recent entry on this list is less than a decade old, but expanding outside the top 5, most of the biggest blowouts come from a bygone era. Number 6 on the list is another Kentucky game from 1948, and number 7 is an OVC game from 1955. Call those honorable mentions, I guess. You know why I think this happened? I think there were just fewer good basketball players back then. If you had them, you were set. If you didn't, this happened to you. These days, blowouts like this hardly even happen in non-conference play. The biggest blowout in any recent year is usually just from whichever power team wanted to run the score up on Mississippi Valley State. These margins would break the 69-point record, I'm not gonna say it, but these Delta Devil teams are several orders of magnitude worse than anyone Utah or Arkansas would face in a conference tournament. We've never seen a high major team that bad, and we never will. But conference realignment's in full swing again. New programs are coming up from D2 and even D3 almost every year. Maybe we'll get another Buffalo situation and someone will end up in a conference that way overmatches them. Maybe we'll get another revenge tour. Or maybe some team will just absolutely crap the bed for no good reason. If there's one thing I've learned with this sport, it's to never say never. Hey, remember David Peterson, the depressed Pepperdine fan from Highway 2? Well, the two of us and a few of our buddies have started a Substack. It's called The Low Major, and it'll mainly cover off-the-beaten-path sports stuff just like this, but we've got a whole lot more in store. Subscribe for free at thelowmajor.substack.com, and if you're watching this as it debuts, join us every day this week for a fun new piece on the magic of conference tournaments. I'd also love it if you'd subscribe to this channel and consider supporting me on Patreon, where you can get your name in the credits for $6 a video. Thanks, and see you next time. Okay, fine, I'll say it. Nice!